The sun hung low over the Arizona Territory, painting the barren landscape in shades of crimson and gold. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient sentinels, their shadows stretching long across the dusty plains. A hot wind swept through the sparse vegetation, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day ahead. Margaret Sullivan adjusted her bonnet against the relentless sun, her blue eyes scanning the horizon from her perch atop the wagon. At 23, she possessed the quiet strength of a frontier woman, though her hands remained soft from a life that had known more comfort than most who dared venture into this unforgiving land. Her father, Thomas Sullivan, had insisted they join the wagon train heading west to California, lured by tales of fertile valleys and new beginnings. "Margaret, come back inside," her mother called from within the canvas-covered wagon. "This sun will ruin your complexion." But Margaret couldn't tear her gaze from the vast expanse before them. Something felt wrong. The desert was too quiet, the birds that usually circled overhead notably absent. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had fallen silent. Their wagon train consisted of 12 families, 37 souls in total, making their way along the well-worn trail that countless others had traveled before them. The men walked alongside the oxen, rifles within easy reach, while women and children rode in the wagons among their worldly possessions. They had been on the trail for 3 months, and California seemed both impossibly far and tantalizingly close. It was young Timothy Morrison who saw them first. The boy's terrified scream pierced the afternoon stillness like a knife. Indians! The word had barely left his lips when the thunder of hooves filled the air. They came from behind the red rocks where they had waited with the patience of hunters who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, descended upon the wagon train like a violent storm. Margaret watched in frozen horror as chaos erupted around her. Men scrambled for their weapons while women pulled children into the dubious safety of the wagons. The crack of rifles mixed with war cries and the screams of the terrified. Arrows whistled through the air, finding their marks with deadly precision. "Margaret, get down!" Her father shoved her roughly to the wagon bed before turning to face their attackers. His rifle raised, she saw him fire once, twice, before an arrow sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it with an expression of mild surprise before crumpling to the ground. "Father!" Margaret's scream was lost in the mayhem. Her mother tried to reach him, but another arrow found her as she climbed from the wagon. She fell beside her husband, her hand stretching toward his in their final moment. The attack was swift and merciless. The Apache warriors moved with practiced efficiency, overwhelming the wagon train's defenses within minutes. Margaret pressed herself against the wagon's wooden floor, her whole body trembling as she listened to the sounds of death and destruction around her. Then, suddenly, strong hands seized her. She fought wildly, kicking and clawing at her attacker, but he was immovable as stone. When she looked up into his face, her breath caught in her throat. Unlike the older warriors, this one appeared to be in his late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes as dark as midnight. War paint streaked across his face in bold patterns. But beneath it, she could see the strong lines of his features. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, the other warriors were gathering what they deemed valuable from the wagons. Margaret saw other women being dragged away, their cries piercing her heart. But this warrior, her captor, seemed in no hurry. His grip on her arms was firm, but not cruel, and something in his bearing spoke of authority among his people. When he finally moved, it was to throw her over his shoulder as easily as if she weighed nothing. Margaret pounded her fists against his back, screaming until her throat was raw, but he paid her no mind. He carried her to his horse, a magnificent paint stallion that stood calmly amid the chaos. As he secured her to the saddle, Margaret caught sight of her parents' bodies lying in the dust, their blood seeping into the thirsty earth. The image seared itself into her memory, feeding a rage that burned through her fear. She would not forget. She would not forgive. The warrior mounted behind her, one arm wrapped around her waist to keep her from falling or fleeing. Up close, She could smell the mixture of smoke, leather, and something wild that clung to him. His chest was bare save for a vest of hide and bone, and she could feel the heat of his skin through her thin dress. As they rode away from the decimated wagon train, Margaret forced herself to look back one last time. Smoke was beginning to rise from the wagons as the Apache set them ablaze. The dreams and hopes of 12 families reduced to ash and memory in less than an hour. Her entire world, everything she had known and loved, disappeared into the heat shimmer of the desert. The warrior said something in his language to the others, and they laughed, a harsh sound that made Margaret's skin crawl. She was a prize, she realized, a trophy of their successful raid. The thought filled her with fresh fury. She tried to throw herself from the horse, preferring death to whatever fate awaited her. But the warrior's arm tightened around her, holding her in place with infuriating ease. "I'll never submit to you," she hissed through clenched teeth, not caring that he probably couldn't understand her. Never. If he comprehended her words, he gave no sign. They rode on in silence, the band of warriors moving swiftly across the desert landscape. Margaret's bonds chafed against her wrists where he had tied them to the saddle horn, and her throat burned with thirst and unshed tears. But she would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. As the miles stretched between her and the ruins of her former life, Margaret Sullivan made a vow. She might be a captive, might be considered nothing more than spoils of war, but she would never truly be conquered. These savages, as her people called them, had taken everything from her, but they would not take her spirit. They would not take her will to survive and, somehow, escape. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. In the distance, she could see the dark shapes of mountains rising from the desert floor. That was where they were headed. She realized, into the heart of Apache territory, where no white person ventured willingly and lived to tell the tale. Behind her, the warrior remained silent, his presence a constant reminder of her new reality. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to block out the image of her parents' bodies, trying not to think about what horrors the coming night might bring. She thought instead of her comfortable home back in Missouri, of the piano in the parlor and the garden her mother had tended with such care. That life seemed like a dream now, something that had happened to another person in another lifetime. The horse's steady gait and the heat of the day began to take their toll. Despite her fear and anger, exhaustion crept through Margaret's limbs. She fought against it, knowing that sleep would make her vulnerable, but her body betrayed her. As darkness began to fall across the desert, she found herself sagging against the warrior's chest, his arm the only thing keeping her upright. In her last conscious moments, she felt him shift slightly, adjusting his hold on her. Was it her imagination, or was there something almost gentle in the gesture? But no, these were the people who had slaughtered her family without mercy. There was no gentleness in them, no humanity. They were exactly what everyone had warned her about when her father announced their plans to go west, as sleep finally claimed her. Margaret's last coherent thought was a promise to herself. She would survive this. She would endure whatever came next, and someday, somehow, she would make them pay for what they had done. The Apache might have taken her as their spoil, but she would never truly belong to them. The war party rode on through the night, their captive's golden hair gleaming in the moonlight, a banner of their victory and a symbol of the two worlds that could never peacefully coexist in this harsh and beautiful land. The journey through the wilderness became a test of endurance that pushed Margaret to her very limits. For 3 days they rode without rest, stopping only to water the horses at hidden springs known only to the Apache. The landscape transformed from open desert to rocky canyons, then to pine-covered mountains that rose like dark giants against the sky. Margaret's lips cracked from the desert heat, and her throat felt like sandpaper. The warrior behind her, she had heard the others call him Kuruk, occasionally tilted a water pouch to her lips, but never enough to truly quench her thirst. She wanted to refuse even these small mercies, but her body's desperate need for water overcame her pride. The sun was merciless during the day, beating down on them until Margaret felt she might burst into flames. Her fair skin, despite the protection of her bonnet, burned and peeled. At night, the temperature plummeted, and she shivered uncontrollably in her thin dress. Kuruk wrapped a blanket around her shoulders one evening, but she shrugged it off, preferring to freeze rather than accept anything from him. He picked up the blanket without comment and draped it over her again. This time, when she tried to remove it, his hand caught hers, holding it still for a moment. His touch was surprisingly gentle, but Margaret jerked away as if burned. She kept the blanket on after that, telling herself it was only practical. Dead captives were worthless, after all. The other warriors treated her with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. Some would gesture at her and laugh, making comments in their language that needed no translation. But none dared touch her. Kuruk's claim was clearly respected. She noticed how the others deferred to him despite his relative youth, how they looked to him for decisions about their route and camping spots. On the fourth day, exhaustion finally overwhelmed her stubborn resistance. Margaret had been walking for hours, her hands bound with a leather cord that connected to Kuruk's horse. Her feet, accustomed to proper boots, were raw and bleeding in the worn shoes that were never meant for such harsh travel. Each step sent shoots of pain up her legs, but she refused to show weakness. The path they followed wound up a steep mountainside, little more than a goat track between towering pines. Loose stones shifted beneath her feet, and more than once she stumbled, only to be pulled upright by the inexorable tug of the rope. Her vision began to blur, dark spots dancing at the edges. The world tilted sickeningly, and she knew she was about to fall. When her knees buckled, she expected to hit the ground hard. Instead, strong arms caught her before she could fall more than a few inches. Kuruk had dismounted with fluid grace, reaching her in time. For a moment, she found herself cradled against his chest, looking up into those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. There was something in his expression, not pity, exactly, but a kind of recognition, as if he understood her refusal to break, even respected it. The moment stretched between them, charged with intention she didn't want to name. Then, without warning, he lifted her onto his horse. "No," she protested weakly, trying to slide back down. "I can walk," he said something in Apache, his tone firm but not harsh. When she continued to resist, he simply picked her up again and placed her more securely on the horse's back. This time, he mounted behind her, ending any further argument. Margaret sat rigid in the saddle, trying to maintain distance between them despite the impossibility of it. But as the hours wore on and exhaustion pulled at her consciousness, she found herself leaning back against him. His chest was solid and warm, and despite everything, she felt safer than she had since the attack. She hated herself for that feeling. They camped that night by a stream that tumbled down from the mountains in a series of small waterfalls. The sound of rushing water was torture to Margaret's parched throat. When Kuruk untied her hands and gestured toward the stream, she didn't hesitate. Pride be damned, she needed water. She knelt by the stream's edge and cupped the cold, clear water in her hands, drinking deeply. It was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. She drank until her stomach hurt, then splashed the icy water on her burned face and arms. When she finally looked up, Kuruk was watching her from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. "What do you want from me?" she asked, knowing he probably couldn't understand but needing to voice the question anyway. "Why did you take me?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. Then he spoke, his voice deep and measured. "You, strong." Margaret blinked in surprise. He knew at least some English. "Strong?" She laughed bitterly. "I'm your prisoner. That's not strength. Here." He touched his chest, over his heart. "Strong here." Before she could respond, one of the other warriors called out something, and Kuruk's attention shifted. He replied sharply, and Margaret caught the warning in his tone. The other man shrugged and turned away, but not before shooting her a look that made her skin crawl. That night, Kuruk positioned himself between her and the rest of the war party. Margaret lay on the hard ground, staring up at the star-filled sky, and wondered at this small protection. Was it merely preserving property, or was there something more? The next morning brought new challenges. They descended into a canyon so deep that sunlight only reached the bottom for a few hours each day. The walls rose sheer on either side, red rock layered with white like a giant's birthday cake. Ancient drawings marked some of the stones, spirals and stick figures and animals she couldn't identify. Bones littered one section of the canyon floor. Some were clearly animal, but others— Margaret tried not to look too closely at those that seemed disturbingly human in shape. Skulls grinned up at them from the dust, empty sockets full of shadow and old violence. "This is what you are," she said to Karuk's back, her voice shaking with exhaustion and rage. "Death, that's all your people bring." He glanced back at her but said nothing. What was there to say? They both knew the truth of this frontier, that it was written in blood on both sides, a cycle of violence that seemed to have no end and no beginning. By the seventh day, Margaret's world had narrowed to the simple act of surviving each moment. Her dress hung in tatters, torn by thorns and branches. Her hair, once her pride, was a matted mess despite her attempts to keep it braided. She had stopped trying to maintain her dignity. What was the point when every moment was a struggle just to keep moving? They climbed ever higher into the mountains, following trails that seemed impossible for horses to navigate. Yet the Apache mounts were sure-footed as mountain goats, picking their way across narrow ledges that made Margaret's stomach lurch. She closed her eyes during the worst parts, pressing her face against Karuk's back and trying not to think about the dizzying drops mere inches away. It was during one such crossing that disaster nearly struck. A rattlesnake, coiled in the shadow of a rock, struck at the horse's legs. The animal reared in panic, and for one terrifying moment, Margaret felt them tipping backward toward the abyss. She screamed, certain they were about to plunge to their deaths. But Karuk's skill as a horseman saved them. With subtle shifts of weight and pressure, he brought the horse back under control, guiding it past the snake and onto safer ground. Margaret found herself clinging to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. When she realized what she was doing, she tried to pull away, but her trembling muscles wouldn't cooperate. "You— safe," Karuk said quietly, his English halting but clear. "I not let you fall." The words stirred something in her chest that she didn't want to examine. This man had taken her from everything she knew, had participated in the slaughter of her family. She should hate him with every fiber of her being. And she did, mostly. But in moments like this, when his actions showed a care that went beyond merely preserving valuable property, her hatred became confused with other emotions she couldn't name. It would be easier if he were simply cruel, if he treated her as the others clearly would have. This unexpected consideration was more unsettling than brutality would have been. They stopped early that day at a sheltered spot where a spring bubbled up from the rocks. The water formed a small pool before disappearing back into the earth. Karuk allowed her to wash herself in relative privacy, standing guard with his back turned while she cleaned the worst of the trail dirt from her skin and hair, as she wrung water from her tangled locks. Margaret caught her reflection in the pool's surface. She barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Gone was the proper young lady who had set out from Missouri with such hope. In her place was someone harder, leaner, with eyes that had seen too much. "You not break," Karuk said from behind her, making her jump. She hadn't heard him approach. "Others think you weak, white woman." He shook his head. "They wrong." Margaret stood slowly, water dripping from her hair. "And what do you think?" He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was seeing past all her defenses, straight to the core of who she was. "I think you survive. Like Apache woman, strong." The comparison should have insulted her. Instead, she found herself oddly moved by what was clearly meant as a compliment. She turned away, disturbed by her own reaction. Stockholm Syndrome. Wasn't that what they called it when captives began to sympathize with their captors? She had read about it in newspaper accounts of other frontier kidnappings. No, she would not fall into that trap. Karuk might be less brutal than the others, might even show moments of unexpected kindness, but he was still her enemy. Still the man who had torn her from her life and carried her into this wilderness prison. As they prepared to continue their journey, Margaret steeled herself for whatever lay ahead. They had to be nearing their destination. She could sense anticipation in the warriors' movements, hear it in their increasingly animated conversations. Soon, she would face whatever fate awaited her in the Apache camp, but she would face it with her head high and her spirit unbroken. They might possess her body, but her soul remained her own, and somehow, someday, she would find her way back to freedom. The sun was setting as they crested one final ridge. In the distance, smoke rose from numerous fires, and Margaret could make out the shapes of dwellings scattered across a hidden valley. Her journey as a captive was ending, but she sensed a new and perhaps more dangerous chapter was about to begin. The Apache camp sprawled across the hidden valley like a living organism. Wickiups of bent willow and hide dotting the landscape in organized clusters. Smoke from cooking fires hazed the evening air, carrying the scent of roasting meat and burning pine. Children's laughter mixed with the barking of dogs and the low murmur of conversation, creating a symphony of domestic life that seemed impossibly at odds with Margaret's conception of these savage people. As their party descended into the valley, word of their arrival spread like wildfire. People emerged from their dwellings to witness the returning warriors and their prizes. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of stares, curious, hostile, appraising. Women with babies on their backs paused in their work to observe her, their dark eyes unreadable. Elder men, faces weathered by countless seasons, watched with the stillness of those who had seen many such scenes before. The children were the boldest, running alongside the horses, pointing and chattering excitedly. One small boy, no more than 5 or 6, reached up to touch Margaret's torn dress. His mother quickly pulled him back, scolding in rapid Apache, but not before Margaret saw something in the child's face that transcended cultural boundaries. Simple, innocent curiosity. Karuk guided his horse through the camp with the confidence of someone returning home. People called out greetings, and he responded with nods and brief words. Margaret noticed how even here, among his own people, he commanded respect. Young women watched him pass with interest that needed no translation, their gazes sliding to Margaret with varying degrees of hostility. They stopped before a wickiup larger than most, decorated with painted symbols Margaret couldn't decipher. An elderly woman emerged, her face a map of wrinkles, her gray hair bound in the traditional style. She looked from Karuk to Margaret, her expression sharp with intelligence. Karuk dismounted and helped Margaret down, his hands steady on her waist until her trembling legs found their strength. He spoke at length with the elderly woman, his grandmother. Margaret guessed from their interaction. The woman circled Margaret slowly, examining her like one might inspect livestock at market. When the old woman reached out to touch Margaret's golden hair, Margaret jerked back instinctively. The woman said something sharp, and several people laughed. Heat flooded Margaret's cheeks, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "She is mine," Karuk said in English, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Then he repeated it in Apache, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My prize, taken in battle. She belongs to me." The declaration sent a chill down Margaret's spine. She was property now, no different from a horse or a weapon claimed in raid. The reality of her situation crashed over her anew, and she had to lock her knees to keep from swaying. An argument broke out between Karuk and another warrior, a man Margaret recognized from their journey. He gestured angrily at her, his meaning clear even without understanding the words. Others joined in, voices rising, and Margaret found herself at the center of what appeared to be a dispute over her fate. Karuk's voice cut through the discord like a blade. He stepped forward, placing himself between Margaret and the arguing warriors. His stance radiating challenge, the message was unmistakable. Anyone who wanted to contest his claim would have to go through him. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring. Then the elderly woman spoke, her voice carrying the authority of years. Whatever she said seemed to settle the matter, at least temporarily. The crowd began to disperse, though Margaret could still feel the weight of their stares. "Come," Kuruk said, taking her arm. He led her to a smaller wickiup near his grandmother's. Ducking through the low entrance, Margaret followed reluctantly, her heart hammering. The interior was surprisingly spacious, with a fire pit in the center and bedding of furs and woven blankets around the edges. Weapons hung from the wooden framework, bows, quivers, a rifle that looked military issue. Various pouches and containers held what she assumed were personal belongings. Kuruk gestured to a pile of furs in one corner. "You sleep there." "I won't. You can't expect me to—" Margaret's voice trailed off as the full implication hit her. They would be sharing this space, living together as, what? Master and slave? Captor and prisoner? "You safe," he said, reading her fear. "I not—" He seemed to search for words, then simply shook his head. "You safe." Margaret wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Safe? She was a captive in an Apache camp, surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her kind. Her parents were dead, her future destroyed. How could he speak of safety? But as she looked into his dark eyes, she saw something that gave her pause. Sincerity. Whatever else he might be, in this moment, he meant what he said. "I will never accept this," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "You can keep me here, but I will never stop trying to escape. I will never stop hating what you've done." His expression didn't change. "I know." The simple acceptance of her declaration threw her off balance. She had expected anger, threats, perhaps violence, not this calm acknowledgement of her defiance. A woman entered the wickiup bearing food, some kind of stew in a clay bowl, and flat bread. She set it down without looking at Margaret, spoke briefly to Kuruk, and left. The smell of the food made Margaret's stomach clench with hunger, but pride kept her from reaching for it. Kuruk took the bowl and held it out to her. "Eat. I'd rather starve." He shrugged and set the bowl within her reach, then began tending to his weapons. Margaret watched him from the corner of her eye as he checked his bow, tested the string, examined each arrow with practiced care. His movements were economical, efficient, speaking of years of training. Finally, hunger won over pride. She reached for the bowl, telling herself she needed strength if she was going to escape. The stew was surprisingly good. Venison, she thought, with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify. She ate slowly, conscious of his occasional glances. Night fell fully, and the camp settled into evening routines. Through the wickiup's entrance, Margaret could see families gathering around their fires, hear the low murmur of voices and occasional laughter. It was so terribly normal, so human, that it made her chest ache with confused emotion. These were supposed to be bloodthirsty savages, yet here they were living their lives much as any community might. Children played games in the firelight. Women gossiped as they worked. Men shared stories of the day's hunt. If she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine herself back in Missouri, listening to the familiar sounds of evening settling over her neighborhood. But then she would open them and see the foreign surroundings, feel the weight of her captivity, remember the blood on the desert sand. The normalcy was an illusion, or perhaps a torment, showing her a life she could never be part of, a humanity she was forced to witness but forbidden to share. Later, Kuruk's grandmother entered, carrying items that she set before Margaret, a dress of soft doeskin, moccasins, and various implements Margaret didn't recognize. The old woman spoke at length, gesturing at Margaret's torn clothing. "She says you dress like a Apache woman now." Kuruk translated, "Your clothes." He gestured at her tattered dress. "No good." Margaret clutched the fabric of her dress, the last link to her former life. "No, these are my clothes. I won't become one of you." The grandmother said something that sounded like a curse and threw up her hands in exasperation. She spoke rapidly to Kuruk, clearly displeased with Margaret's refusal. "You make choice." Kuruk said after his grandmother left. "Wear Apache clothes, or wear nothing when those—" he pointed at her dress. "Fall apart." Margaret bit her lip until she tasted blood, fighting back tears of frustration and rage. Every choice was being stripped from her, every piece of her identity challenged. But she would not cry. She would not give them that satisfaction. "I choose my own clothes until they fall to pieces," she said through clenched teeth. "And then I'll fashion new ones from bark and leaves before I dress like your people." To her surprise, Kuruk smiled. Just a slight upturn of his lips, but unmistakable. "You would," he said, almost admiringly. "Strong like mountain lion, but foolish too." He prepared for sleep, unrolling his own bedding on the opposite side of the fire. Margaret watched warily, but true to his word, he made no move toward her. Instead, he lay down with his weapons close at hand and appeared to fall asleep almost instantly. Margaret remained awake, staring at the smoke hole above where stars glittered like cold diamonds. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the wicky-up walls. Outside, the camp gradually quieted, though she could hear the occasional voice or dog bark. Her mind raced with plans and possibilities. She needed to learn the layout of the camp, identify the best routes for escape. She needed to somehow acquire supplies, water, food, perhaps a weapon. Most importantly, she needed to figure out which direction led back to civilization. But even as she planned, a small voice whispered doubts. How far could she get on foot in this wilderness? She had no idea where the nearest fort or settlement might be, and if the Apache caught her trying to escape— She shuddered, remembering the bones in the canyon. Across the fire, Kuruk shifted in his sleep, in the dim light, with his face relaxed and unguarded. He looked younger, less fierce. Margaret found herself studying him despite herself. What drove a man like this? What did he think about when he looked at her? She forced her eyes closed, angry at her own curiosity. He was her enemy. The fact that he hadn't brutalized her didn't change that. The fact that he showed moments of unexpected kindness didn't erase the blood on his hands. But as exhaustion finally pulled her toward sleep, Margaret couldn't deny the truth that whispered in her heart. She was alone here, more alone than she had ever been in her life. And in this strange, frightening new world, her captor was the only one standing between her and potentially worse fates. The thought terrified her more than all the rest combined. Tomorrow she would be strong again. Tomorrow she would plan and scheme and maintain her defiance. But tonight, in the darkness of an Apache wickiup, with the alien sounds of the camp around her and the weight of loss crushing her chest, Margaret Sullivan allowed herself a moment of pure, human vulnerability. She pulled the blanket over her head to muffle any sound and wept silently, bitterly for parents she would never see again, for a life that had ended in violence and dust, and for the uncertain future that stretched before her like an endless, thorny path. When dawn came, she would be ready to face it with renewed determination. But for now, in the darkest hours of the night, she mourned everything she had lost and steeled herself for the battles yet to come. Days blended into weeks as Margaret learned the rhythms of Apache life. Each morning, she woke to the sound of women preparing the cooking fires, the smell of smoke mixing with the crisp mountain air. Despite her initial resistance, necessity forced her to participate in daily tasks, hauling water from the stream, gathering firewood, learning which plants were edible and which would kill. The Apache women watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. They spoke around her, not to her, their rapid conversation a constant reminder of her outsider status, but they also taught through example, showing her how to scrape hides, weave baskets, and prepare the endless meals that camp life demanded. Margaret's hands, once soft and unmarred, became calloused and cracked. Her back ached from bending over grinding stones, turning dried corn into meal. The doeskin dress Kuruk's grandmother had offered still lay folded in the wickiup. Margaret stubbornly clung to her tattered American clothes, though they barely held together anymore. It was during a particularly scorching afternoon that she first witnessed the softer side of her captor. A group of children had cornered an injured rabbit, poking at it with sticks as it tried desperately to escape. Their laughter was cruel, the casual cruelty of youth that exists in every culture. Karuk appeared suddenly, his voice sharp with reprimand. The children scattered like quail, leaving the trembling rabbit behind. He knelt beside the creature, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined its twisted leg. Margaret watched from where she sat grinding corn, expecting him to quickly end its suffering. Instead, he carefully splinted the tiny leg with twigs and sinew, then carried the rabbit to a shaded spot near his wickiup. He built a small pen from branches and left water within reach. The entire scene was so at odds with the fierce warrior who had taken her that Margaret found herself staring. "Why?" she asked when he passed near her. "It's just a rabbit. Injured prey." He paused, considering her question. "Everything fights to live," he said simply. "Brave hearts deserve chance." That evening, as they ate in their usual silence, Margaret found herself thinking about his words. Did he see her as another wounded creature, fighting to survive? The thought should have angered her, but instead it stirred something more complex. The next test came when a group of young warriors decided to amuse themselves at her expense. 3 of them cornered her near the stream where she was filling water gourds. Their leader, a man called Naichi who bore obvious scars from many battles, blocked her path back to camp. He said something in Apache that made his companions laugh. When Margaret tried to step around him, he moved to block her again, his smile predatory. He reached for her hair, and she slapped his hand away, causing more laughter. "Leave me alone," she said firmly, though her heart raced with fear. Naichi's eyes narrowed at her defiance. He grabbed her wrist, his grip painful, and pulled her closer. She could smell the bear grease in his hair, see the cruelty in his smile. The other warriors egged him on with calls and whistles. Margaret tried to pull free, but his strength was overwhelming. Panic rose in her throat as he dragged her toward a cluster of boulders, away from the view of camp. She opened her mouth to scream, but his free hand clamped over it. The blow came from nowhere. One moment Naichi was dragging her along. The next he was sprawling in the dust, blood streaming from his nose. Karuk stood over him, his face a mask of cold fury. The 2 men circled each other like wolves, while the other warriors backed away. Words were exchanged, challenges. Margaret guessed from the tone. Naichi wiped blood from his face and charged. The fight was brutal and swift. Both men were skilled warriors, trained from childhood. But Karuk had the advantage of righteous anger. They grappled in the dust, trading blows that would have killed lesser men. Margaret pressed herself against a boulder, torn between relief at the rescue and horror at the violence. It ended with Karuk's knife at Naichi's throat, the defeated warrior pinned beneath him. For a terrible moment, Margaret thought she was about to witness a killing, but Karuk merely pressed the blade enough to draw a thin line of blood, then spoke in a low, dangerous voice. Whatever he said, it was enough. When he released Naichi, the scarred warrior slunk away without a backward glance, his friends following. Karuk rose slowly, checking his own injuries. A split lip, bruised ribs, a gash on his arm that bled freely. He turned to Margaret, and she saw concern flicker in his eyes before his usual stoic expression returned. "You hurt?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her wrist throbbed where Naichi had grabbed it, but that seemed insignificant compared to what might have happened. "Come." He started back toward camp, and she followed on unsteady legs. At his wickiup, he gestured for her to wait while he gathered supplies to tend his wounds. "Let me," Margaret heard herself say. The words surprised them both. He studied her for a long moment, then handed her the item's clean cloth, a pottery jar of salve that smelled of pine and something medicinal. She had tended enough injuries on the wagon train to know what to do. Her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned the gash on his arm. This close, she could see other scars, a map of violence written on his skin. He sat perfectly still, watching her face as she worked. "Why did you fight him?" she asked quietly. I'm just property to you. Why risk injury? You are under my protection, he said simply. My honor. Your honor. She tied off the bandage with perhaps more force than necessary. What about my honor? My family's honor? His jaw tightened. War is war, but you are here now. Under my protection. I never asked for your protection. No, but you have it. They sat in silence as she tended the other wounds. When she dabbed at his split lip, he caught her wrist gently, so different from Nietzsche's cruel grip. Why you help? He asked. Margaret met his gaze, unsure of the answer herself. I don't know. You helped me. Even though I am enemy? Yes, she whispered. Even though. Something shifted in that moment, subtle but undeniable. They were still captor and captive, still divided by an ocean of blood and cultural difference. But they were also two people who had shown each other unexpected kindness in a harsh world. That night, the camp gathered for a ceremonial dance. The drums began at sunset, their rhythm hypnotic and primal. Margaret watched from the doorway of the wickiup as dancers moved around the great fire, their shadows writhing like living spirits. The ceremony was for successful raids. Karuk explained, a celebration of survival, of bringing resources back to the people. Margaret thought of the wagon train, of families destroyed for these resources, and bile rose in her throat. My parents are dead so you could dance, she said bitterly. Karuk was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was heavy. My father died in soldier attack on peaceful camp. My mother burned alive in wickiup. Your people celebrate such victories too. Margaret had no answer for that. She had heard tales of army massacres, of peaceful villages destroyed, but they had always seemed distant, abstract. Here, looking at the man whose protection had become her lifeline, they were terribly real. Does it ever end? She asked. The killing, the revenge. When mountains crumble to dust, he said. When rivers run backward. When peoples learn to see hearts, not skin. The dancing continued late into the night. Margaret dozed fitfully, the drums invading her dreams. She saw her parents dancing with painted warriors, saw herself spinning around the fire, her golden hair streaming like flames. When she woke, Karuk was sitting by the dying fire, staring into the embers. In the dim light, she could see the exhaustion in his posture, the weight he carried. It occurred to her that being a warrior, constantly fighting, constantly proving strength, must be its own kind of prison. Do you ever wish for a different life? She asked softly. He glanced at her, surprised she was awake. Sometimes I dream of peace, land without blood, but dreams are for sleep, not waking. I used to dream of California, Margaret said, surprising herself with the confession. Orange groves and ocean breezes, a new life. She laughed bitterly. I suppose I got a new life, just not the one I imagined. Life never gives what we imagine, Karuk said, only what is. They sat in companionable silence as the camp slowly quieted around them. Margaret found herself thinking about the wounded rabbit, still recovering in its makeshift pen. Everything fights to live, he had said. Brave hearts deserve a chance. Perhaps that's all any of them were doing, fighting to live in a world that seemed determined to destroy them all. Apache, American, it didn't matter. They were all just wounded creatures, trying to survive another day. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret made a decision. She rose and took the doeskin dress from where it had lain untouched for weeks. Without a word, she stepped outside to change. When she returned, Karuk's eyes widened slightly at the transformation. The dress fit well, soft and practical, allowing freedom of movement her tattered American clothes no longer provided. She had not surrendered, she told herself. She had simply adapted. Now you look like Survivor, Karuk said, and his approval warmed her more than it should have. Margaret lifted her chin with the same defiance she'd shown since the first day. "I am a survivor," she said. "That's one thing your people and mine have in common." As the sun rose over the Apache camp, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Margaret Sullivan stood between two worlds. No longer fully the woman she had been, not yet the woman she was becoming, but for the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of something that might have been hope. She was surviving, and perhaps in this harsh and beautiful land, that was its own form of victory. The attack came with the dawn, sudden and devastating. Margaret woke to the thunder of cavalry horses and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Screams pierced the morning air as blue-coated soldiers poured into the valley from 3 directions, their planned assault designed to prevent escape. Karuk was already moving, grabbing his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Stay inside," he commanded, but Margaret could only press herself against the wicky-up wall as chaos erupted outside. Through the entrance, she witnessed a scene from hell itself. Women fled with children in their arms, only to be cut down by cavalry sabers. Warriors rushed to mount a defense, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. The soldiers showed no mercy, firing into wicky-ups where families huddled together. An elderly man emerged from his dwelling, hands raised in surrender. A young soldier shot him down without hesitation. Margaret watched in horror as the old man crawled toward his doorway, leaving a trail of blood, before going still. This wasn't warfare, it was slaughter. Karuk fought like a man possessed, his bow singing as arrow after arrow found their marks. But for every soldier who fell, 3 more seemed to take his place. The Apache warriors were being pushed back, overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. A soldier burst into their wicky-up, his eyes wild with battle fever. He raised his pistol toward Margaret, seeing only another Apache woman in her doeskin dress. Time slowed to a crawl as she stared down the barrel of the gun. Karuk's knife took the soldier in the throat before he could fire. The man gurgled, dropped his weapon, and collapsed. Karuk grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her over the body and out into the melee. "Run!" he shouted, pushing her toward the canyon walls. "That way! Go!" But Margaret couldn't move. All around her, the camp she had come to know was being destroyed. The woman who had taught her to weave baskets lay motionless by her loom. Children she had watched playing were scattered like broken dolls. A rifle ball whistled past her ear, snapping her from her paralysis. Karuk shielded her with his body as they ran, dodging through the burning wicky-ups toward the narrow canyon that offered the only escape route. Other survivors were fleeing in the same direction, mostly women and children, with a handful of warriors fighting a desperate rearguard action. Karuk pushed Margaret ahead, then turned back to help hold the line. "No!" She grabbed his arm. "You'll die." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw not the fierce warrior, but the man who had protected her, who had shown her kindness in captivity. "Go," he said softly. "Live." Then he was gone. Rejoining the fighting, Margaret was swept along by the tide of fleeing Apache, her feet moving without conscious thought. Behind them, the sound of battle grew more distant but no less terrible. They climbed higher into the canyon, following paths Margaret had never seen before. An old woman stumbled, and Margaret helped her up, supporting her weight as they struggled onward. It didn't matter anymore that these were her captors. They were simply people trying to survive. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and terror when they finally stopped in a hidden valley high in the mountains. Margaret collapsed with the others, her legs trembling from exertion. Of the 100 or more who had lived in the camp, perhaps 30 had escaped, and Karuk was not among them. Margaret found herself scanning each group of stragglers that arrived, hope dying a little more with each absence. Warriors spoke in low voices of the battle, of friends and family left behind. The numbers were devastating. Night fell, bringing bitter cold. The survivors huddled together without fires, afraid the smoke would draw pursuit. Margaret shared her blanket with 2 orphaned children, their small bodies shaking with cold and trauma. It was near dawn when he appeared, materializing from the shadows like a ghost. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood soaking through a crude bandage. Dirt and gore covered him from head to foot, but he was alive. Margaret didn't think. She ran to him, catching him as his knees buckled. "You're hurt," she said unnecessarily, her hands already checking his injuries. "Had worse." He managed, though his face was gray with pain and blood loss. She helped him to a sheltered spot, then set about doing what she could with limited supplies. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, leaving a clean wound but significant damage. As she worked, he told her in broken phrases about the battle's end. The soldiers had burned everything, leaving nothing but ashes and bodies. Warriors had sold their lives dearly to buy time for the escape. The Apache band that had existed for generations was effectively destroyed. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, surprising herself with the genuine emotion behind the words. "I'm so sorry." Karuk studied her face in the dim light. "You cry for Apache?" She touched her cheek, finding it wet. When had she started weeping? "I cry for all of it, the waste, the hatred, the endless killing. My people did this, but—" She struggled for words. "It could just as easily have been yours attacking a white settlement. And around it goes. You understand now," he said quietly. "No good, no evil, only pain." They sat in silence as dawn broke over the mountains. The surviving Apache would have to move again soon. Find a more secure location. Try to rebuild something from the ashes. Margaret knew she should be planning escape. The chaos provided perfect opportunity. With the band scattered and weakened, she might actually make it to a fort or settlement. But as she looked at the wounded man beside her, at the traumatized children nearby, at the faces etched with loss and grief, she found her desire for escape had evaporated like morning mist. Where would she go? Back to the world that had sent soldiers to slaughter women and children. Back to people who would see her time among the Apache as a stain that could never be washed clean. "You saved my life," she said suddenly. "That soldier would have killed me. You wore our clothes." He saw Apache woman, not white captive. "No." She shook her head. "He saw a human being and chose to kill anyway." "You saw a human being and chose to protect." Something shifted in Karuk's expression. He lifted his good hand to her face, thumb brushing away a tear she didn't know had fallen. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "Margaret," he said. The first time he had used her name, it sounded foreign on his lips, yet somehow right. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. Two people from different worlds, brought together by violence, held apart by history. Yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. She leaned closer, drawn by something stronger than reason. His hand slipped to the back of her neck, tangling in her golden hair. Their lips met in a kiss that was desperate and tender at once, an affirmation of life in the face of death, a bridge across the chasm of their differences. When they parted, both were breathless. Margaret's heart raced as the full impact of what had just happened crashed over her. She had kissed her captor, the man who had taken her from her family, but he was also the man who had protected her, who had shown her kindness and humanity in a brutal world. "This changes nothing," she whispered, though even she could hear the lie in her words. "Changes everything," he corrected softly. A child's cry broke the spell, returning them to harsh reality. Margaret moved to help tend the wounded, but her thoughts remained tangled. The kiss had been a moment of madness, born from trauma and desperate circumstances. It meant nothing. But as the day wore on, and she caught Karuk watching her with those dark, knowing eyes, she feared it meant everything. The survivors moved deeper into the mountains that afternoon, seeking a more defensive position. Margaret walked beside the travois carrying Karuk, steadying it over rough ground. Other Apache watched her with new interest. She had proven herself during the escape, helping their people without being asked. As they made camp in a box canyon with fresh water and good sight lines, Margaret realized with a start that she was thinking tactically, like someone invested in the group's survival. When had she stopped being purely a captive? When had these people become individuals to her rather than faceless enemies? That night, as she changed Karuk's bandages by firelight, he caught her hand. "That soldier," he said. "You could have let him shoot, been free. Margaret considered her words carefully. Free to go where? To people who would send soldiers to murder children? To a world that sees only savages and enemies instead of... She paused, searching for words. Instead of people trying to survive, just like us. You are changed, he observed. Yes, she admitted. I am changed. The woman who was captured at that wagon train is gone. I don't know who I am now. I know. Kuruk said with quiet certainty. You are Margaret, strong like mountain, fierce like eagle, heart that sees truth through pain. His words broke something inside her. She bent her head, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She wept for her parents, for the destroyed Apache camp, for the children orphaned on both sides. She wept for the woman she had been and the uncertain creature she was becoming. Kuruk pulled her against his good shoulder, holding her as she cried. His presence was solid, real, the one constant in a world gone mad. When her tears finally stopped, she didn't pull away. What happens now? She asked against his chest. We survive, he said simply. Together or apart, we survive. Together or apart. The choice loomed before her, no longer as clear as it once had been. The kiss had changed everything. As he said, it had shown her possibilities she never imagined, feelings she never expected. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Margaret allowed herself one moment of complete honesty, somewhere between captivity and chaos, between hatred and understanding. She had begun to care for this man who should have been her enemy. The Apache might have taken her as spoils, but that desperate kiss in the dawn light had turned the tables. The captor had become the captivated. The conquered had become the conqueror. And Margaret Sullivan, raised to see the world in black and white, was learning that the heart recognized no such boundaries. The hidden valley became their refuge, a world unto itself carved from red rock and silence. For weeks, the survivors focused on the immediate necessities of survival, finding food, securing water, tending wounds both physical and spiritual. Margaret threw herself into the work, her hands and skills proving valuable as they rebuilt some semblance of life. She and Kuruk had fallen into an unspoken partnership. During the day, they maintained careful distance, aware of the eyes upon them. But at night, when darkness provided cover, they would sit together by the dying embers of their fire, sharing stories in their broken common language. Tell me of your home, Kuruk asked one evening, his shoulder finally healing enough for him to move without wincing. Before, Margaret closed her eyes, summoning memories that felt like they belonged to another person. We had a house with white-painted shutters. Mother grew roses by the front door, yellow ones that smelled like heaven. Father would read to us by the fireplace on winter evenings. Her voice caught. It seems like a dream now. Dreams are important, he said. They keep spirit alive when body wants to surrender. She studied his profile in the firelight. What do you dream of? Peace, he answered without hesitation. Valley where children play without fear, where warriors become hunters, not killers. Where? He paused, glancing at her. Where Apache and white can share fire without hatred. That's a beautiful dream, Margaret whispered. An impossible one, but beautiful. All best dreams seem impossible until they are not. Their hands found each other in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that should have frightened her. Instead, she felt only a deep contentment, a rightness that defied all logic. The fragile peace couldn't last. Scouts reported increased military activity in the lowlands, patrols searching for the escaped Apache. Food grew scarce as hunting parties couldn't range far without risk of discovery. The band would need to move soon, deeper into Mexico perhaps, or further into the uncharted mountains. It was during a brief hunt for rabbits that everything changed. Margaret had become proficient with snares, her smaller size allowing her to place them in spots the men couldn't reach. She was checking her trap line when she heard horses approaching. Her heart leapt to her throat as she recognized the blue uniforms through the trees. A cavalry patrol. Only 6 men, watering their horses at the stream below. So close to camp, if they continued up the canyon, They would discover everyone. Margaret crouched behind a boulder, mind racing. She could call out, reveal herself. They would see a white woman and rescue her, take her back to civilization, back to safety, back to a life where she belonged. But she thought of the children in the camp, playing quietly with dolls made of grass, of the old woman who had taught her which roots were good for fever, of Kuruk, who would die defending them all if the soldiers came. Moving carefully, silently, she crept away from the patrol and back toward camp. She had to warn them, give them time to scatter or hide. Her choice was made without conscious thought. She would not be the cause of another massacre. She ran as she had never run before, feet flying over familiar paths, bursting into the camp. She gasped out warning between gulps of air. "Soldiers, at the stream! Coming this way!" The response was immediate. Warriors grabbed weapons while women gathered children and essentials. In minutes, the camp was dissolving like smoke, people melting into predetermined hiding spots among the rocks. Kuruk gripped her shoulders. "You could have gone with them." "I know," she said simply. Something fierce and proud blazed in his eyes. He pulled her against him, kissing her hard before pushing her toward a concealed cave. "Hide, no matter what you hear, stay hidden." The next hours were agony. From her hiding place, Margaret could hear the soldiers moving through the canyon, their voices carrying in the still air. They found the recently abandoned camp, evidence of habitation that excited them. "They can't have gone far," she heard a sergeant say. "Spread out. Check every crevice." Boots crunched on gravel terrifyingly close to her position. Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows, barely breathing. A shadow fell across the cave entrance. If he looked inside, a rifle shot echoed from another direction, followed by shouts. The shadow moved away as the soldier ran toward the commotion. More shots, the sound of horses. Then, gradually, blessed silence. It was full dark before Kuruk came for her. "Safe now," he said, helping her from the cramped cave. "They found nothing, chased shadows, but we must move tonight." As the band prepared for another relocation, Margaret noticed the looks thrown her way had changed. She had warned them. She had chosen them over her own people. In that moment of decision, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. They traveled by moonlight through passes Margaret couldn't have found in daylight. By dawn, they had reached another hidden valley, this one with ancient ruins that spoke of peoples long vanished. As they set up temporary shelters, exhaustion weighed on everyone. Kuruk found her sitting alone on a crumbling stone wall, staring at the sunrise, painting the clouds in shades of rose and gold. "You regret?" he asked, settling beside her. "I should," Margaret admitted. "I should regret not taking my chance at freedom, but I don't." She turned to face him. "What's happening to me? I'm not Apache, but I'm not who I was anymore either." "You are becoming who you were meant to be," he said. "Not Apache, not white, just Margaret, just woman with brave heart who sees past skin to spirit." She laughed, but it came out closer to a sob. "My parents would be horrified. Everything they taught me, everything I believed. Parents teach what they know. Sometimes what they know is not enough for a world their children must live in." They sat in comfortable silence as the camp slowly came to life around them. Margaret found herself leaning into Kuruk's warmth, drawing comfort from his solid presence. When had this man shifted from captor to protector to something more? "I need to ask you something," she said suddenly. "That first day, when you took me, why me? There were other women in the wagon train." Kuruk was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "I saw you watching the desert before attack. Others looked at ground, at wagons, at each other. You looked at horizon like you were trying to see beyond, like you were already looking for something more than life you had." He paused. "And when I grabbed you, you fought, not with tears or begging, but with fury, with spirit that would not break." "So you took me because I fought you?" "I took you because I recognized you. Warrior spirit in woman's body, kindred soul in enemy form." His hand found hers. "I did not know then what you would become to me. And what have I become to you?" The question emerged as barely a whisper. He turned her face toward his with gentle fingers. "Everything," he said simply, and kissed her. This kiss was different from their first desperate meeting of lips. This was slow, deep, a claiming and a surrender all at once. When they parted, Margaret felt as though the last walls around her heart had crumbled like the ancient ruins around them. "I love you," she breathed, the words escaping before she could stop them. Then, stronger, "God help me, I love you." His smile transformed his usually serious face. "And I love you, golden-hair woman who sees with clear eyes, love you more than life, more than breath." They held each other as the sun climbed higher. Two souls who had found each other across an impossible divide. Margaret knew the challenges ahead were enormous. Their worlds would never accept what they had found. There would be no place for them in either society. But in this moment, in this ancient place where other lovers might have made similar impossible choices centuries before, none of that mattered. They had survived loss and violence, had chosen each other over the safety of their separate worlds. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked, voicing the question that hung between them. "Now we live," Karuk answered, "day by day. We live, together." She thought of the life she had planned. California, orange groves, a proper marriage to a proper man. That dream was as dead as her parents, buried in desert sand. But from its ashes had risen something she never expected, a love that transcended everything she thought she knew about the world. "Together," she agreed, sealing the promise with another kiss. As the day wore on and the band settled into their new temporary home, Margaret worked alongside the Apache women with a new sense of belonging. She wasn't one of them, might never truly be, but she was Karuk's woman now, by choice rather than capture, and that created its own place for her. That evening, as she taught some of the children a clapping game from her youth while their mothers prepared the meal, Margaret caught Karuk watching her with such naked affection it took her breath away. She smiled at him across the fire, no longer caring who saw or what they thought. She had been taken as spoils of war, had entered this world as a captive filled with hatred and fear. But love had transformed her prison into a home, had turned her captor into her chosen companion. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to conquer her spirit, Karuk had instead lost his own heart. In fighting against her fate, she had discovered a destiny she never imagined. They had each thought themselves the victor, only to discover they were both willing captives of something stronger than either had expected. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret Susan took her place beside Karuk at their fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers. The world beyond their hidden valley would continue its violent dance of raid and retaliation. But tonight, they had each other. Tonight, love had conquered conquest itself. And that, Margaret thought as she rested her head on Karuk's shoulder, was the greatest victory of all. The soldiers came at dawn, surrounding the valley with military precision. This time there was no warning, no chance to flee. Margaret woke to rifles being cocked and harsh commands shouted in English. Through the wiki-up entrance, she saw blue uniforms everywhere, their trap perfectly sprung. "Come out slowly. Hands where we can see them." Karuk reached for his weapons, but Margaret caught his arm. "No," she whispered urgently. "They'll kill you all." His jaw clenched, but he saw the truth in her words. The Apache were outnumbered 10-1, caught in the open with nowhere to run. Fighting meant annihilation. They emerged together into the cold morning air. Margaret blinked in the sudden brightness, her hand instinctively finding Karuk's. All around them, Apache were being forced to their knees at gunpoint. Children cried as they were torn from their mother's arms. A captain on horseback surveyed the scene with satisfaction. His gaze fell on Margaret, taking in her doe-skin dress and sun-darkened skin, then widening as he noticed her blue eyes and golden hair beneath the dirt. "Dear God," he breathed. "You're white." Before Margaret could respond, soldiers were pulling her away from Karuk. She fought against them, reaching back for him, but more men restrained him as he struggled to get to her. "No," she cried. "Let me go. You don't understand." "Ma'am, "You're safe now," the captain said, dismounting. "These savages can't hurt you anymore. What's your name? How long have you been captive?" "I'm not—" Margaret's words were cut off as a blanket was wrapped around her shoulders, hiding the Apache dress. Gentle hands guided her toward the horses while she twisted to keep Karuk in sight. Their eyes met across the chaos. In his face, she saw not fear for himself, but anguish for her. He knew what she had only begun to realize. Their world, their impossible love, was being torn apart by forces beyond their control. "That one," a soldier said, pointing at Karuk. "He was holding her hand. Must be the one who took her." "String him up," another suggested. "Save the court the trouble." "No!" Margaret tore free from her escorts, stumbling back toward Karuk. "He protected me." "You can't—" Strong arms caught her, lifting her off her feet as she fought wildly. "Ma'am, you're hysterical. It's natural after what you've been through, the shock—" "Listen to me." But they weren't listening. In their eyes, she was a victim to be saved, traumatized beyond rational thought. Her protests only confirmed their assumptions. They carried her to a wagon that had been brought for wounded, settling her inside despite her continued struggles. Through the canvas, she could hear the soldiers processing their prisoners, men separated from women and children, weapons confiscated, hands bound. "Please," she begged the soldier assigned to guard her, a young private who looked barely old enough to shave. "That man, the warrior who was with me, don't let them hurt him." The private shifted uncomfortably. "Don't you worry, miss, you're safe now. We're taking you home." Home. The word was a mockery. Home was Karuk's arms. Home was the fire they shared, the stories told in broken English and gesture. Home was a feeling, not a place, and they were tearing her from it. The journey to Fort Buchanan took 3 days. Margaret spent them in a state of numb despair, mechanically eating the food they brought her, answering their questions in monosyllables. The captain, a man named Reynolds, tried repeatedly to get her story. "Margaret Sullivan," she finally told him. "Taken from a wagon train 5 months ago." "Your family?" "Dead." He nodded sympathetically. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you're safe now. We'll contact any surviving relatives. Get you back to civilization." Civilization? Margaret wanted to laugh at the word. She had seen civilization in the massacre of the Apache camp, in soldiers shooting fleeing women and children. She had found more humanity among the savages than in her own people's actions. "The prisoners," she ventured. "What will happen to them?" Reynolds' face hardened. "Justice, Miss Sullivan. Don't you worry about them anymore." But she did worry. Every moment, every heartbeat was filled with fear for Karuk. She had seen frontier justice, knew what it meant for Apache warriors who had dared take white women. The thought of him hanging from a rope, those gentle hands stilled forever, made her physically ill. At the fort, she was handed over to the commander's wife, Mrs. Colonel Harrison, a stern woman who took one look at Margaret's Apache dress and sun-damaged appearance and declared it absolutely scandalous. "We'll get you proper clothes immediately, Hunnu," she said briskly. "A bath, decent food, and then we'll work on undoing the damage those heathens have done." Margaret submitted to being bathed and dressed like a doll, her hair washed and pinned up in a proper style. Looking in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a pale ghost of the woman she had been, disguised as the lady she had once been. "There, Mrs. Harrison said with satisfaction. "You look almost civilized again, though that complexion, well, time and proper care will help." That evening, Margaret was expected to dine with the officers and their wives. She sat at the elaborate table, crystal and china gleaming in the lamplight, and felt more alien than she ever had among the Apache. The conversation flowed around her, gossip, military movements, complaints about the heat and the dust and the Indian problem. "Miss Sullivan has been through quite an ordeal," Mrs. Harrison announced. 5 months among those beasts. It's a miracle she's intact." The meaningful pause made Margaret's cheeks burn. She knew what they were all thinking. The question they were too polite to ask directly. Had she been violated? Was she still pure? In their world, that mattered more than anything else about her experience. "They treated me well," she said quietly, causing a stir of disbelief. "Stockholm Syndrome," the fort doctor murmured. "Common in these cases." Captives begin to identify with their captors as a survival mechanism. Margaret bit her tongue to keep from screaming that it wasn't a syndrome. It was love, but these people would never understand. To them, she was a victim to be pitied and rehabilitated, not a woman who had chosen her own path. That night, in the comfortable bed Mrs. Harrison had provided, Margaret lay awake planning. She had to find out where they were holding Karuk, had to help him somehow, but she was watched constantly, treated like a fragile flower that might break at any moment. Days passed in suffocating routine. Margaret was expected to help with fort social activities, to slowly readjust to civilized life. She played the part, hiding her desperation behind a mask of quiet compliance. All the while, she gathered information. The Apache prisoners were being held in the fort stockade, awaiting transport to the reservation. The warriors would be tried for various raids, with hanging the likely outcome for the leaders. Margaret's heart clenched when she overheard that the one who took the Sullivan woman was being held separately, scheduled for swift justice. Her chance came during a fort social, when most of the garrison was distracted by visiting dignitaries. Margaret slipped away from the party, her heart pounding as she made her way through shadows toward the stockade. The guard was young, bored, unprepared for a properly dressed white woman approaching with tears streaming down her face. "Please," she sobbed, playing on his sympathy. I need to see him. The one who took me, I need to face him, to tell him what he did to me. For my healing, the doctor said, please, just for a moment." The guard wavered, clearly uncomfortable with female tears. "I don't know. Miss, I'm not supposed to. Please," Margaret pressed, letting her voice break. "I'll never be free of the nightmares unless I confront him. Just 5 minutes. You can watch the whole time." Finally, moved by her apparent distress, he relented. 5 minutes, and I'm staying right here." He led her to an isolated cell at the end of the building. Through the bars, she saw Karuk sitting against the wall, chains on his wrists and ankles. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but he was alive. His good eye widened when he saw her. "Margaret?" She rushed to the bars, reaching through to touch his face. "What have they done to you?" "Questions," he said simply, wanting me to tell of raids, of killings. "I tell nothing. I'm going to get you out," she whispered urgently. "I don't know how, but—" "No." His voice was firm. "You must not. You safe now. Stay safe." "Safe?" She nearly laughed. "I'm dying here. Karuk. Every moment without you is death." "You will live," he said, his chained hands covering hers through the bars. "You will survive. For both of us." "Miss, time's up," the guard said nervously. Margaret gripped Karuk's hands tighter. "I love you, no matter what happens. Remember that. I love you, and I love you, golden hair warrior woman, in this life and the next." The guard pulled her away. Her last sight of Karuk burned into her memory, proud even in chains, love and sorrow mingling in his battered face. Margaret maintained her act until she was back in her room, then collapsed in genuine sobs. She had to save him. But how? She was one woman, watched and guarded, with no weapons and no allies. The fort was full of soldiers who saw Karuk as nothing but a savage to be eliminated. Through her window, she could see the gallows being constructed in the fort courtyard. Time was running out, and with it, any hope of happiness she might have found in this harsh land. But Margaret Sullivan had survived capture, transformation, and loss. She had crossed the boundaries between worlds and found love where it should have been impossible. She would not give up now. As dawn approached, she began to plan. The Apache had taught her patience, strategy, survival. Karuk had shown her that brave hearts deserve a chance. She would give him that chance, or die trying. The night of the planned execution arrived with a crescent moon barely lighting the desert sky. Margaret had spent 3 days playing the perfect recovering captive, earning enough trust that her guards had grown lax. She attended dinners, helped with mending, and spoke when spoken to about the horrors of her captivity, each lie burning her throat like acid. But she had also listened, learning guard rotations and discovering that the stockade's back entrance was watched by only one man during the midnight shift. She had stolen supplies bit by bit, a knife from the kitchen, rope from the stables, men's clothing pilfered from the laundry. At midnight, she slipped from her window using skills learned navigating Apache camps in darkness. Her heart hammered so loud she feared it would wake the fort. But she moved like Karuk had taught her, heel to toe, testing each step, becoming one with shadows. The guard at the stockade's rear was dozing, rifle propped against the wall. Margaret crept behind him, pressing the knife to his throat before he could cry out. "One sound and you die," she whispered, hardening her voice. The man froze, recognizing the steel in her tone wasn't bluff. She had learned too much about survival to hesitate now. She bound and gagged him with practiced efficiency, then took his keys. Inside the stockade, she found Karuk in his cell, alert despite the late hour as if he had sensed her coming. "Margaret, no," he breathed when he saw her. "They will hunt you. Then we'll be hunted together," she said, working the lock with trembling fingers. "I won't watch you die. I won't live in their world without you." The lock clicked open. She helped him out, his movements stiff from days of chains. They couldn't free the other prisoners without raising an alarm, a fact that tore at Margaret's conscience. But Karuk was her priority. They slipped through the fort like ghosts, Margaret leading him to where she had hidden horses and supplies. She had chosen their mounts carefully, army horses, strong and fast, provisioned for a long journey. As they mounted up, Karuk caught her face in his hands. "You throw away your world for me." "No," she corrected. "I'm choosing our world, whatever that means, wherever that leads." They rode hard through the night, pushing the horses to their limits. By dawn, they were deep in the mountains, following paths Margaret remembered from her captivity. The irony wasn't lost on her, retracing the route of her kidnapping. But this time as a willing fugitive. Behind them, she knew the alarm had been raised. Search parties would be forming, tracking dogs released. They were outlaws now, both of them, existing between worlds that would accept neither. They rested briefly at midday in a box canyon, watering the horses at a hidden spring. Karuk's face was grim as he studied their back trail. "They come," he said simply. "Many men. We cannot outrun forever. Then we go where they can't follow." Margaret said, "Mexico, the deep mountains, somewhere." "Running always," he said softly. "This is life you choose?" She met his eyes steadily. "A life with you is the only life I choose. Everything else is just existing." They pushed on through terrain that grew increasingly wild. Margaret had changed into the men's clothing she'd stolen, her hair bundled under a hat. From a distance, they might pass for two vaqueros or drifters. Up close, nothing could disguise what they were: a white woman and an Apache warrior. Proof of boundaries crossed and taboos shattered. On the third day, with pursuit closing in, they found themselves at a river crossing. The water ran fast and deep with snowmelt, dangerous to cross but offering the possibility of losing their trail. "We swim horses across." Karuk decided. Cold water carries scent away from dogs. They plunged in, the icy current immediately trying to sweep them downstream. Margaret's horse struggled, panicking mid-river. She felt herself slipping from the saddle, the weight of her soaked clothing pulling her down. Karuk was there instantly, one arm hauling her against him while he guided both horses with iron determination. They emerged on the far bank gasping and shivering but alive. "Always saving me," Margaret said through chattering teeth. "Always saving each other," he corrected. They took shelter in a cave to dry off and rest. As Margaret wrung water from her clothes, She felt Kuruk watching her with an expression of wonder mixed with sorrow. "What?" she asked. "I think of first time I saw you. Proud white woman on wagon, looking at horizon like answers were there. Now look dressed like man, running like Apache, choosing exile for love." He shook his head. "I have destroyed you." "No," Margaret said fiercely. "Going to him. You've freed me. That woman on the wagon was sleepwalking through life, following paths others set for her. You woke me up. You showed me who I really am. And who are you?" "Yours," she said simply. "Just as you're mine. Everything else, Apache, white, captive, free, those are just words. We're two people who found each other against all odds. That's our truth." They made love there in the cave with desperate passion, aware it might be their last time, when they lay entwined afterward. Kuruk traced the planes of her face as if memorizing them. "If they catch us," he began. "They won't," Margaret interrupted. "And if they do, I regret nothing. These months with you have been more real than all my years before." They rode on at dusk, always south, always higher into the mountains. The landscape became a primordial wilderness of towering peaks and plunging valleys. Here, in these ancient places, the divisions of civilization seemed meaningless. Days blended together in a rhythm of movement and survival. They hunted together, made camp together, faced each challenge as one. Margaret's skin darkened to bronze. Her body grew lean and strong. She could read sign, find water, move silent as any Apache. Sometimes they encountered others, Mexican shepherds, indigenous traders, fellow outcasts existing on the margins. Money and trade goods Margaret had stolen from the fort bought supplies and silence. Most asked no questions. Recognizing kindred spirits living outside society's bounds, they settled finally in a valley so remote it appeared on no maps. A creek ran through it. Cottonwoods provided shade, and game was plentiful. Together they built a simple shelter that grew over time into a real home. Not Apache, not American, but uniquely theirs. Seasons passed in their hidden paradise. Margaret learned to work hides into clothing, to preserve meat for winter, to read weather in cloud formations. Kuruk carved furniture from deadfall, built clever irrigation channels for the small garden Margaret planted with seeds traded from passing merchants. They were not completely isolated. Occasionally, Apache bands would pass through, updating them on the wider world. The wars continued, the cycle of raid and retaliation grinding on. But here in their valley, they had found peace. One autumn evening, as they sat watching sunset paint the peaks in shades of fire, Kuruk spoke of the future. "If child comes," he said carefully, "what world will they belong to?" Margaret placed his hand on her belly, where new life had recently quickened. "Our world," she said. "We'll teach them both ways. Let them choose their own path. They'll be bridge between worlds, like us. Bridges get walked on from both sides," he warned. "Or they connect separated shores," she countered. "Our children will be proof that love is stronger than hate, that people can choose unity over division." He pulled her close, and they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky, somewhere beyond their valley. Two civilizations continued their bloody dance toward an inevitable conclusion. The Apache would be forced onto reservations, their way of life systematically destroyed. The frontier would be tamed, fenced, divided into neat parcels that left no room for nomadic peoples. But here, in this moment, none of that could touch them. They had created their own world through sheer force of will and love. They were no longer conqueror and conquered, captor and captive. They were simply Margaret and Kuruk, two souls who had found home in each other. "I never answered your question properly," Margaret said suddenly. "That day in the fort, when you asked who I am, you said you were mine." Kuruk recalled. "Yes, but more than that." She turned to face him fully. "I'm the woman who chose love over safety, truth over comfortable lies. I'm proof that hearts can change, that enemies can become lovers, that the human spirit can transcend any boundary." She smiled. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, who was taken as spoils but conquered her captor's heart instead." Kuruk's answering smile was radiant. "And I'm the warrior who won greatest victory in defeat, the love of woman worth more than all treasures." They sealed their words with a kiss as stars wheeled overhead. Infinite and eternal as love itself. In the morning, they would face whatever challenges came. There would be hardships, dangers, the constant vigilance of the hunted. But they would face them together. Two people who had rewritten their destinies and found paradise in exile. Their love had transformed captivity into freedom, conquest into surrender, making a mockery of the very concepts that had brought them together. The Apache had taken her as spoils. But in the end, love had conquered them both. And in that victory, they had both won everything that truly mattered. Thank you for listening to this story of love transcending boundaries in the Old West. If you enjoyed Margaret and Karuk's journey, please comment below and let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with you. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about their incredible story. What touched your heart the most? We can't wait to hear from you.